She survived a broken engagement, a ruined reputation, and years of silence. Then a duke who had never needed anything, needed her. Wiltshire, March 1814. The ledger was wrong again. Margaret Forsythe had known it before she opened it, had known it the way she knew when the roof above the east passage was considering a leak, or when cook was approaching the end of her patience. A particular quality of dread that lived in the chest and asked nothing of the mind. She sat at her father's desk, which was now her desk, and added the column for the third time, and arrived at the same number, which was not the right number, and set down her pen. Outside, the elm trees were conducting their early March performance, just green enough to suggest hope, not green enough to justify it. Margaret had stopped trusting March 2 years ago. March was when the solicitor had arrived with the papers. March was when she had learned that her father's affairs, managed with enormous charm and very little rigour over the course of 30 years, had left the Forsythe household carrying debts that would require a decade of careful work to retire. She had been 22. Her sister Louisa had been 16. Their mother had taken to her room for 6 weeks and emerged, blinking, to find that Margaret had already spoken to the solicitor, the banker, the tenants, and cook, and had arranged without fanfare for the household to continue. That had been the first lesson. Competence, Margaret had discovered, was not rewarded with admiration. It was rewarded with more to be competent about. The second lesson had come 11 months later, in the form of Mr. Charles Aldwick. She did not think about Mr. Aldwick often. She had trained herself out of it, with the same methodical patience she applied to the ledgers, identifying the thought, refusing to follow it, returning her attention to what was real and present and required action. But March had a way of undoing that discipline. March smelled like the particular afternoon he had come to call, the windows open to the first warm air of the year, the parlour full of watery light, her mother flushed with something very like triumph. He had been handsome. He was still handsome, presumably, wherever he was. He had been kind and funny in a quiet way, and he had looked at Margaret as though she were the only person in any room he had ever entered. For 4 months she had allowed herself, carefully, cautiously, to believe it. Then his mother had come to call, alone without him. A social visit, ostensibly. Tea was served, pleasantries were exchanged, and then Mrs. Aldwick, in a tone of such perfect courtesy that it took Margaret a full 10 seconds to understand what was being said, had explained that Charles was, of course, very fond of Miss Forsythe, very fond indeed, but that the family had certain hopes for his future, and that a young woman in Miss Forsythe's particular circumstances, she had paused there with a smile that meant everything the pause contained, perhaps ought to set her sights a little closer to home. Margaret had poured more tea. She had said nothing that could be repeated unfavourably. She had waited until Mrs. Aldwick left, and then she had sat very still in the parlour for perhaps 20 minutes before going back to the ledgers. Charles had not come himself. He had written a letter of such elaborate, agonized apology that it managed to say almost nothing at all. She had read it once, understood it completely, and fed it to the kitchen fire. The word that followed her afterward was unsuitable. She did not know who had said it first. By the time it reached her, it had already been repeated enough to have the quality of established fact. That had been the second lesson. And Margaret, who was nothing if not a quick study, had learned it thoroughly. The world had a place for her, and it was not the place she had briefly, foolishly imagined. She picked up her pen and returned to the ledger. The letter from her mother arrived on a Tuesday, which was already unpromising. Her mother wrote on Tuesdays when she had something she knew Margaret would object to, reasoning, not incorrectly, that the middle of the week softened resistance. "My dear Margaret," it began, "Louisa is in excellent spirits and her complexion has quite recovered from the cold she took in January. Mrs. Holt says she has never seen a girl better suited to a London season, and I am inclined to agree, though of course you know best in these matters." This was her mother's method, to agree that Margaret knew best, and then to explain what Margaret would therefore certainly agree to. "I have written to your aunt in Portman Street, and she is more than willing to have us for the season. It will cost very little. Louisa has her new white muslin which wants only a ribbon, and I shall wear the grey silk which is perfectly respectable. You will need something, of course, but I am sure you have something suitable already put by." Margaret read this twice. Her mother believed that wardrobes replenished themselves through a process of optimistic inattention. "It is Louisa's best chance, March." The letter continued, and here Margaret's objections began to dissolve, because this was true. Louisa was 20, with her mother's prettiness, and thank God, rather more of her father's sense. She was good-natured and warm, and genuinely well-read, and she deserved a season. She deserved the chance Margaret had not properly had not properly taken, or perhaps had not been permitted to keep. Margaret folded the letter, looked out the window at the elm trees. London, then. She would balance the ledger before she left, and she would leave detailed instructions for the steward, and she would pack one good evening dress and the grey wool that was almost respectable, and she would take Louisa to London for the season. Not for herself. She was quite clear on that point. She was 24 with a damaged reputation and no fortune, and 7 years of household management to recommend her, none of which were qualities that London particularly rewarded. She was going for Louisa. She had learned her lessons. She was not going to unlearn them. She first encountered the Duke of Wyndham at a concert she was not enjoying. It was the 3rd week of the season. Louisa had been to 4 balls and 2 card evenings, and a breakfast that had inexplicably lasted until 4 in the afternoon, and was flourishing. Margaret had attended everything, positioned herself in the reliable geography of the chaperone, near the wall within sight of her charge, holding a glass of something she never finished, and had found the whole enterprise less disagreeable than she'd expected. The concert was at Lady Ashton's house in Grosvenor Square, which was large enough to absorb 200 guests without effort. The musicians were accomplished. The programme was Handel, which Margaret genuinely liked. She had secured a chair slightly apart from the main cluster of chaperones, where she could hear the music, without being required to discuss it, and had been quietly content for the better part of an hour. Then the door opened during the second movement, and there was a small rustle of attention, the particular rustle that meant someone significant had arrived. Margaret did not look up immediately. She was listening to the oboe, which was doing something precise and lovely in the upper register, and she saw no reason to interrupt it for a late arrival. She heard the whispers, "Wyndham, that is Wyndham, I did not know he was in town," and registered in the abstract way one registers distant weather that this was apparently of consequence. She looked up when the oboe paused. He was taller than she'd expected from a duke, which was a foolish thought since dukes came in all sizes, and she had no reason to have expected anything in particular. He was dark-haired, perhaps 30 or a little more, with the kind of face that looked as though it had made a decision some years ago to stop being surprised by things, and had largely succeeded. He was scanning the room in a way that was not quite polite, not rude exactly, but searching, with a specific quality of purpose that suggested he was looking for something rather than simply taking in the company. His gaze reached Margaret's corner and stopped. She was looking directly at him, which was also not quite polite, and she recognized that a fraction of a second too late to do anything about it. So she held it, evenly, without particular expression, for the 2 seconds it took him to look away and take his seat. The oboe resumed. Margaret returned her attention to it. She did not think about him again until the interval, when Lady Ashton's daughter appeared at her elbow in a flutter of ivory silk, and said, entirely unprompted, "Is it not extraordinary that the Duke of Wyndham has come? He is almost never in town before May. Some say he prefers his estate. Some say," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "that he finds the season tedious." "That makes 2 of us," Margaret said pleasantly. Miss Ashton laughed, surprised. "You are very droll, Miss Forsythe." Margaret smiled and said nothing further, and Miss Ashton moved on, and the second half of the concert began, and the Duke of Wyndham was 4 rows ahead and slightly to the left, and Margaret did not look at the back of his head at all. Or not more than twice. The oboe did not deserve the competition. He found her at the interval of Lady Pemberton's rout 9 days later, which was either coincidence or something that required more careful examination. Margaret was standing near the window of the second drawing-room, not hiding precisely, but occupying a space that required some effort to reach, between a large arrangement of hothouse flowers and a small table of untouched refreshments. Louisa was visible across the room, laughing at something a perfectly acceptable young man had said, which meant Margaret could breathe for 5 minutes. "Miss Forsythe." She turned. He was closer than she'd expected. People of his rank generally maintained a larger perimeter, enforced by the unconscious deference of everyone around them. He had apparently walked through that perimeter without noticing it existed. "Your Grace," she said. She kept her voice level because there was no other sensible option. "You were at Lady Ashton's concert," he said, not a question. "I was." "You were listening to the oboe." She looked at him more carefully. "Most people were listening to the oboe, Your Grace. That was broadly the occasion." "Most people," he said, "were listening to each other." This was accurate. Margaret did not say so because agreeing too readily with a man who had just introduced himself by commenting on her listening habits seemed imprudent. "Are you acquainted with my family, Your Grace? I confess I am not certain how—" "I am not," he said. "I asked Lady Pemberton your name." A pause. Margaret processed this information with the care it deserved. He had asked Lady Pemberton her name, not Louisa's name. Louisa, who was in the first flush of her season and genuinely lovely, and precisely the sort of girl dukes were supposed to notice. Her name. "How thorough of you," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one held in reserve. "You were the only person in the room who did not look up when I arrived." "I was listening to the oboe." "Yes," he said, "that is why I asked." Margaret studied him. He was perfectly composed, the practiced ease of a man who had been the most important person in every room he'd entered since the age of probably 12. But there was something underneath it that was neither performance nor condescension. He was genuinely curious about her. She could not quite account for it, and things she could not account for made her cautious. "I am here as a chaperone, Your Grace," she said. "My sister Louisa is making her come out this season. She is the pretty one by the fireplace, speaking to the young man in the blue coat." "I see her," he said without looking. "She is also considerably better company than I am," Margaret said. "She laughs at things because she finds them funny, not because the situation requires it. She is genuinely good. I recommend her to your attention." "Miss Forsythe," he said, and something about the way he said it, not unkindly but with precision, as though her name were a thing he was learning the weight of, made her stop. "I did not come to this window to be redirected." The hothouse flowers were very fragrant. The noise of the rout pressed in around them, 200 people and their attendant ambitions, and Margaret was acutely aware that anyone looking toward this window would see her speaking privately with the Duke of Wyndham, which was exactly the kind of thing that got noticed and discussed and distorted. "I am aware of that," she said. "I am also aware that I am a woman of no particular fortune or standing, who has already had one public disappointment in the matter of a gentleman's attention. You will forgive me if I am not in the habit of assuming the best." He was quiet for a moment. "Who disappointed you?" "That is not a question I intend to answer." "No," he agreed, "I suppose it isn't." He looked at her directly, without the usual performance of not quite looking that men of his rank employed with women they found interesting. "Will you be at the Hartley ball on Thursday?" "I expect so. Louisa has been promised a dance." "Then I will see you there, Miss Forsythe." He inclined his head, correctly the precise degree required by the difference in their positions, and walked back into the press of the rout, and was absorbed by it immediately, because rooms rearranged themselves around him without his appearing to notice. Margaret stood by the hothouse flowers for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she located Louisa across the room, confirmed that the young man in the blue coat was still behaving himself, and went to find somewhere to sit down. She did not think about the way he had said her name. She refused to. She had learned her lessons, and she was not going to unlearn them for a duke who had asked Lady Pemberton her name, and then walked across a drawing room with the calm certainty of a man who had never been refused anything in his life. Although, she made herself stop there. The Hartley ball was everything a London ball in April aspired to be, overcrowded, overwarm, and possessed of a quartet that played with more enthusiasm than precision. Margaret arrived with Louisa and their mother, who had dressed for the occasion in the grey silk and a headdress of uncertain ambition, and who had spent the carriage ride explaining that she had it on very good authority that Lord Hartley's nephew was not yet engaged. "He's not here for Lord Hartley's nephew," Margaret said. "One never knows," her mother said, with the optimism of a woman who had spent 20 years declining to know things that inconvenienced her. Louisa caught Margaret's eye and did not smile, because she was a person of tact as well as good nature. The ballroom was on the first floor, and Margaret took up her position near the east wall with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had mapped the available chaperone territory and made her selection. The musicians were attempting a cotillion. The floor was already full. Louisa was collected almost immediately by a young Mr. Davenport, who had danced with her twice at the Pemberton rout, and whose intentions, if not yet declared, were at least clearly directional. Margaret watched the floor. She was good at this part: the watching, the assessment, the quiet calculation of who was dancing with whom and whether it signified. She had spent her childhood reading rooms and her adulthood reading ledgers. People were, in her experience, not entirely different. She did not look for him. Or rather, she looked for him in exactly the way she would look for any potentially complicating element of the evening, the same attention she gave to the punch bowl's location relative to her mother, or the presence of Mrs. Aldwick, should that lady appear. Practical vigilance, nothing more. He appeared at her elbow at 20 minutes past 10. Miss Forsythe. The name again landing with that particular weight. She had noticed at the Pemberton rout that he said it differently than other people did. Most people said Miss Forsythe as a form of address, a social label, the verbal equivalent of a visiting card. He said it as though he was paying attention to it. Your Grace. She did not turn immediately. She finished observing the measure of the cotillion, confirmed that Louisa was in good hands, and then turned. You did come then? I said I would. Men frequently say things. I am aware, he said. I try not to be one of them. She studied him again, because he consistently invited study and did not seem discomfited by it. Most men of his rank were accustomed to being looked at, but not examined. The Duke appeared to welcome the distinction. He was in dark evening clothes, simply cut, without the elaborate decoration some of his contemporaries favoured. A man who had apparently decided that his own presence was sufficient ornament, which Margaret privately conceded was not an unreasonable assessment. Are you going to ask me to dance? She said. Would you accept if I did? No. Why not? She looked at him steadily. Because I am here as a chaperone, and because dancing with a duke is precisely the sort of thing that becomes a topic of conversation, and because I do not want to be a topic of conversation. And you already are one, he said. You have been seen speaking with me twice. That is sufficient. Margaret breathed once slowly. Then the damage is done, and there is no need to compound it with a dance. The damage, he repeated. Something crossed his face. Not hurt, he was too composed for that, but something that registered the word with more attention than she had expected. Is that how you think of it? That is how the world thinks of it. My thinking is largely irrelevant to the outcome. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the cotillion spun, and the candles guttered in the draught of the dancer's movement, and someone somewhere was laughing too loudly. Will you walk with me? He said. There is a room beyond the card tables that is marginally less audible. I cannot leave the ballroom. Louisa is with Davenport, who appears devoted. Your mother is in conversation with Lady Fitch, which will occupy her for at least half an hour. The card room is visible from the doors. You would be absent from this wall for perhaps 10 minutes. She looked at him. You have been watching us. I arrived 20 minutes ago, he said. I have been learning the terrain. Why? He met her eyes. Because I wanted to speak with you without an audience, and because I was fairly certain you would not make it easy, and because... He paused, the smallest pause. I find that I would like to understand you, Miss Forsythe, and this wall is not conducive to it. The musicians launched into a reel. The volume increased accordingly. 10 minutes, Margaret said, and the doors remain in view. The room beyond the card tables was, as he had promised, quieter. It appeared to be a small library, 3 walls of books, 2 chairs, a lamp. Someone had abandoned a glass of port on the mantelpiece. Margaret stood near the door. The Duke stood near the window, which was a respectful distance, and she gave him credit for it. You said you were not in the habit of assuming the best, he said. What happened? I told you I wouldn't answer that. You did. I'm asking again. He held her look steadily. Not out of prurience. I'm asking because you are, quite deliberately and with considerable skill, telling me who you are before I can form my own opinion, and I would like to understand whether the story you are telling is the accurate one. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Outside dimly the reel. There was a man, she said. He paid me a great deal of attention for 4 months. Then his mother explained to him that I was not suitable. He agreed with her. The word followed me. What word? Unsuitable. He said nothing for a beat, then he was a fool. He was a son, Margaret said. With a mother. It is not a category that requires particular intelligence to inhabit. Something that was genuinely a smile appeared briefly, and she found that it changed the whole arrangement of his face. made it younger and less certain and considerably more dangerous. "And now," he said, "when a man pays you attention, you assume the same outcome." "I assume a rational outcome based on available evidence. I am not that man." "You are a duke," she said. "He was the son of a comfortable country family. The logic that applied to him applies to you with rather more force, not less. Your mother's opinion of what constitutes suitable will not be more flexible than his. It will be more rigid." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have already decided how this ends." "I have simply read the story before." She said it without rancor, not bitterly, just factually, the way she would state a column total. "I do not blame you for your interest, Your Grace. I am not, I hope, so without vanity as to be entirely surprised by it. But I am also not going to perform hope I do not feel, or permit an attachment to form that will reflect badly on us both when it comes to nothing." "When?" he said. "Yes." "Not if." "No." He turned to look at the window, which showed him nothing but his own reflection and the room behind him. Margaret watched him, the line of his jaw, the deliberate stillness of his hands. He was, she thought, a man accustomed to being a certainty in other people's calculations. Being placed firmly in the column of probable losses was something he had not expected. "I have been looking for you since November," he said to the window. She went very still. "I beg your pardon?" He turned back. "I was in Wiltshire in November. My friend Cavendish has a house near Marlborough. There was a village. I rode through it on the Thursday, I believe. There was a woman outside an apothecary's shop arguing, very quietly and with enormous precision, with a man who appeared to be a solicitor." Margaret remembered this perfectly. The solicitor had been attempting to charge her for a consultation she had not requested, on a matter pertaining to a debt she had already settled, with a confidence that had suggested he believed she would not have read the relevant documents. She had read them. He had eventually agreed. "You were on a grey horse," she said before she could stop herself. Something in his face changed. "You saw me." "You rode past. I did not think anything of it." "I thought," he said carefully, "a great deal of it. I asked Cavendish who you were. He didn't know. I asked the innkeeper in the village. He knew the family name, not yours. I wrote to the local magistrate on a pretext." He said this last with the equanimity of a man who understood it was slightly absurd and had made peace with that. "I found that Miss Forsythe of Forsythe House, Wiltshire, would likely be in London for the spring season. So I came to London in March, which I do not ordinarily do." The room was very quiet. Margaret was aware of her own breathing. "You came to London," she said slowly, "in March, because of a woman you saw for 30 seconds outside an apothecary's shop." "Because of a woman," he said, "who was winning an argument with a solicitor without raising her voice in a village where no one was watching her do it." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of the danger of this, the particular and specific danger of a story that was very flattering, told by a man who was very attractive, in a small library where the door was in sight, but so was his face, and his face was doing something she had not expected and could not quite categorize. "That is," she said carefully, "an extraordinary thing to tell a woman you have met twice. I am aware. I considered telling you something more gradual and sensible." He paused. "I decided against it on the grounds that you appear to be someone who can detect sensible fabrication at some distance." She almost laughed. She stopped it, but only barely. "Your Grace—" "James," he said. Then, as though catching himself, "My name is James. You don't have to use it. I simply—" He stopped. "I said I would not be one of those men who says things he doesn't mean. I am attempting to be consistent." Margaret studied the middle distance for a moment. The sound of the reel penetrated faintly through the walls. Someone was clapping on the beat with more vigor than rhythm. "You have 10 minutes, she said at last. "You have used 7 of them. Then I will use the remaining 3 carefully." He looked at her directly. "I am not asking you for anything tonight. I am not asking you to believe in an outcome. I am asking only that you allow me, in whatever capacity your propriety and your caution will permit, to be someone you have actually met, rather than the category you have assigned me to." It was, she acknowledged privately, an intelligent thing to ask. It was also an intelligent way to ask it, calibrated to her precise resistance, which suggested he had listened to everything she'd said with unusual attention. "That is a reasonable request," she said. "Thank you. Do not mistake it for more than it is." "I won't," he said. And then, with the ghost of that dangerous smile, "Miss Forsythe, She turned and walked back toward the ballroom. She did not let herself think about how he had said it. He was careful after that. Careful in a way that Margaret had not expected from a duke, which perhaps said more about her assumptions regarding dukes than about him. He did not pursue. He appeared at the Carrington breakfast, at the Fitch card evening, at the concert in Hanover Square, with a regularity that was clearly purposeful, but he did not engineer private conversation. He was correct. He was present. He was in the way of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the other party to make theirs patient. He danced with Louisa at the Carrington breakfast, which surprised Margaret so thoroughly that she forgot for a moment to be watchful. It was a country dance, easy, cheerful, nothing significant in the choosing, but he danced with her as though she were a person he was pleased to meet. Asking her questions, she answered with obvious delight, making her laugh twice in the first minute. When the dance ended, he brought her back to Margaret with a small bow and said, "Your sister tells me you taught her to read music." "She exaggerates my contribution," Margaret said. "She says," he continued, "that you used to play for 2 hours every evening before." Before. The word had a precise weight in the Forsythe household. Before meant before the solicitor, before the ledgers, before everything that had rearranged itself. Margaret had not played in 2 years. The pianoforte in the Forsythe drawing-room was slightly out of tune and served primarily as a surface on which to place correspondence. "She talks too much," Margaret said lightly. Louisa, who had moved away with the cheerful tact of someone who understood exactly what she was doing, had moved out of earshot. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "One misses a great many things." She kept her tone easy. "One continues regardless." He looked at her for a moment. "That is not an answer." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He did not press it. That was the thing she was beginning to understand about him. He pressed exactly as far as she permitted and stopped at the line she drew, not because he was indifferent to what lay beyond it, but because he was determined to wait until she moved the line herself. It was either very perceptive or very tactical, and she had not yet determined which. Both, possibly. It was Louisa who told her about Charles Aldwick. They were dressing for the Sefton ball. Margaret in the green silk that was her best dress and her most reliable armour, Louisa in white with roses at the hem that their mother had stitched on herself over the course of 4 determined evenings. Louisa had been doing Margaret's hair, which she was better at, and had paused in a way that Margaret recognised as the prelude to something she was steeling herself to say. "Mr. Aldwick is in town," Louisa said to the mirror. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I see. I saw him this morning in the park. He was with his cousin. He asked after you." "Did he?" "He seemed—" Louisa chose her words with the care of someone who loved her sister, and was not entirely certain how that sister would receive them. "He seemed as though he regretted things." "He always seemed that way," Margaret said. "He is a man of considerable feeling and limited resolve. They go together sometimes." Louisa resumed pinning. In the mirror, her expression was the one she wore when she had more to say, and was deciding whether to say it. "He may be at the Sefton ball." "Then I shall be civil." Margaret watched her own face in the glass. "I am always civil." "I know," Louisa set in the last pin. "I just thought you should know before you arrived." "Thank you." She paused. "Louisa." "Yes?" "The Duke of Wyndham will also likely be at the Sefton ball." "A beat." "Yes," Louisa said with extraordinary neutrality. "I expect he might." "I am aware of what you are doing when you move away from conversations." Louisa met her eyes in the mirror. Her expression was entirely innocent in the way that expressions are when their owner has decided that innocence is the safest available policy. "I am simply allowing you space to speak." "You are allowing him space to speak to me." "I have no opinion on the matter," Louisa said and smiled, and the matter was closed, though neither of them believed it was. The Sefton ball was magnificent in the way that only houses with unlimited firewood could achieve in April. Every room lit and warm, every surface reflecting candlelight, the kind of gathering that made London feel, briefly, like the place its inhabitants had always believed it to be. Charles Aldwick found Margaret in the first 30 minutes. She had seen him across the room before he reached her, registered him with the precise emotional weather of someone who has spent a year deciding how they feel about a thing and has arrived at something like peace, but does not entirely trust that peace under direct examination. He was exactly as she remembered. Kind face, good coat. the particular quality of unhappiness that sits on people who have made one significant choice badly and have not yet found a way to stop noticing. "Miss Forsythe," he said. "Mr. Aldwick." She was civil. She had promised herself she would be civil, and she was. "You are well, I hope." "Very well, and yourself?" This was the part where he was supposed to be well, and the subject would change and they would find their way to comfortable nothing. Instead, he said, "No, actually, I am not particularly well. I have not been well for some time." Margaret looked at him. "Mr. Aldwick." "I know," he said quickly. "I know that I am not here to cause you difficulty. I only wanted to—" He stopped. He was not, she remembered, a man who was fluent in the things that mattered. "I wanted to say that I am sorry. Properly. Not in a letter." "You were," she said gently, "very sorry in the letter." "The letter was cowardice. This is—" He looked at her with an honesty that was painful to observe because it was genuine and because it was too late. "I should not have let her decide for me." Margaret held his look steadily. "No," she agreed, "you should not have." He absorbed this. He stopped again. "Is there any possibility at all of—" "No," she said, kindly but clearly. "I do not think there is." He nodded. He had, she thought, expected this and had come anyway, because he was a man who had learned something in the past year and needed to demonstrate it to himself, even if the demonstration arrived too late. She respected that, in the abstract. "Is it—" He glanced across the room and she knew without looking where his glance landed. "Wyndham." She did not answer. "He was watching you," Charles said, "from the moment you entered." Margaret said with great composure, "Good evening, Mr. Aldwick." He inclined his head. "Good evening, Miss Forsythe. I am glad you are well." He walked away. She watched him go with a feeling that was not grief and not relief, but something in between, the sensation of a chapter that had been suspended for a year arriving, quietly, at its last page. She turned. The Duke of Wyndham was not watching her now. He was in conversation with Lord Sefton across the room, composed and attentive, but as she turned, as though he had some peripheral awareness calibrated specifically to her movements, he glanced toward her. "Miss Forsythe." He didn't say it. He was 30 feet away, but she heard it anyway in the particular register he had made her learn to listen for. She looked at him for a moment, just a moment, then looked away. The Dowager Duchess of Wyndham arrived in London on the 14th of April, which Margaret knew because Louisa mentioned it, having heard it from Miss Ashton, who had it from her mother, who moved through London's social information the way a current moves through water, quickly, completely touching everything. "People say she is formidable," Louisa said at breakfast. "People say that about any woman who knows her own mind," Margaret said and poured the tea. "People say she has very particular views about who is suitable for Wyndham." Louisa looked at her plate. "Those were the exact words, I believe. Very particular views about suitability." The word landed precisely where it always landed. Margaret set down the teapot. "That is," she said with a composure she had spent 2 years building to exactly this load-bearing specification, "a very predictable development." "Margaret?" "It changes nothing. There was nothing to change." Louisa looked at her with the expression she wore when she believed Margaret was being a particular kind of stupid, but loved her too much to say so in plain words. "He has been to every event where we have been for 5 weeks. He is a sociable man." "He is famously not a sociable man. Lady Ashton says he attended more events this April than in the previous 2 seasons combined." "Lady Ashton's mother collects information with the thoroughness of a bailiff," Margaret said. "I do not necessarily credit every conclusion she draws from it." And yet nothing. Margaret rose and gathered the breakfast things, because motion was useful and the conversation was becoming one she did not wish to finish. "He is a duke. His mother has very particular views about suitability. I have been this road before and I know exactly where it ends. I am not—" She stopped, set down the cups. "I am not going to let it end there again." Louisa was quiet for a moment, then, "What if it doesn't end the same way?" "It always ends the same way." "Margaret, he rode to London in March for you." "He told you that?" "He told me," Louisa said simply, "when he danced with me at the Carrington breakfast. He told me that he found you in November and that he had been looking forward to the season ever since, and that he hoped I would think well of him." She paused. "He asked my good opinion. He didn't have to do that. Margaret stood with the cups in her hands and said nothing. "He asked your good opinion," she said at last. "Yes." "Of himself?" "Yes." She set the cups down. She walked to the window, the same instinct that took her to windows at home in Wiltshire, the habit of looking out when she needed to think clearly. The street below was its ordinary London self, a coal cart, two women with baskets, a boy running for no visible reason with the pure joy of running. "He should not have told you that," she said finally. "I think," Louisa said behind her, "that he wanted me to tell you." She saw the Dowager Duchess 3 days later at an afternoon concert in Cavendish Square. She recognized her immediately, a woman of 60 or so, upright, dark-eyed, wearing the kind of assured elegance that required no ornamentation. She arrived with 2 companions and was immediately surrounded by people who required her notice, which she dispensed with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing it for 40 years and had reached a productive peace with it. Margaret watched her from across the room with the attention one pays to weather. The Dowager noticed her during the first interval. Margaret knew the moment, the slight alteration in direction, the unhurried examination. She held the look steadily, because she was not going to look away from a woman she had not yet spoken to, regardless of what that woman's opinion of her might be. The Dowager said something to her companion, and then made her way with the inexorable deliberateness of a ship in calm waters, across the room. "Miss Forsythe," she said. "Your Grace." Margaret was careful, correct. She gave nothing. "My son has spoken of you." "I am flattered." "Are you?" The Dowager studied her. The examination was thorough and entirely unembarrassed, the frankness of a woman who had long since decided that the social performance of not quite looking was a waste of everyone's time. Margaret found to her own surprise that she respected it. "He says you are the cleverest woman he has met since his grandmother." "That is very kind." "It is very specific," the Dowager said. "His grandmother was not a comfortable woman. She was right about nearly everything, and she knew it, which is an exhausting combination. James appears to find this quality appealing in a manner that suggests he did not have enough of it around him growing up." Margaret was not certain this required a response. She offered none. "I am told," the Dowager continued, "that you manage your family's estate." "I do." "And that it was in some difficulty when it came to you." "It was." "And that it is no longer." "It is considerably improved," Margaret said with careful accuracy. "It is not yet what it was." The Dowager was quiet for a moment, in the manner of someone allowing a piece of information to settle to its proper depth. "My husband was a man of great charm," she said, "and very little rigour. I managed his affairs for 40 years, and he remained cheerfully unaware of most of it. It was," she said with a dryness that was entirely without bitterness, "an education." Margaret looked at her. "I'm sorry." "Don't be, I was good at it, and he was in his way a good man." She paused. "I have certain views about what James requires. So I have been given to understand." "I expect you have." A corner of her mouth moved. "The difference between what I required for him 10 years ago and what I require for him now," she said, "is that I have watched him for 10 years more, and I understand better what he is. He is not his father. He does not need what his father needed." She looked at Margaret with the particular attention of a woman who has already drawn her conclusions and is checking them against the evidence. "He needs someone who will tell him the truth." Margaret met her eyes. "Most people need that." "Most people need it and cannot bear it," the Dowager said. "They are not the same thing." She inclined her head, precisely, correctly, the greeting of one woman to another, rather than the condescension of a rank to one below it. "Enjoy the second half of the concert, Miss Forsythe." She moved away. Margaret stood with her hands quietly at her sides and breathed once, slowly. The second half of the concert was objectively the better half. She did not hear a note of it. He found her afterward in the entrance hall, while Louisa was collecting their wraps. "My mother spoke to you," he said, "not a question." "She did." "I did not ask her to." "I know." She looked at him. His expression was the careful one, composed surface, something deliberate underneath. She had learned to read the difference in the past 5 weeks, which was information she had not meant to acquire and did not entirely know what to do with. She was not unkind. He absorbed this with visible relief that he immediately controlled. "Good. She is formidable." "Yes." "She loved your father." He went very still. "What did she say?" She said he was charming, and she managed his affairs for 40 years. She said it without bitterness. Margaret looked at him steadily. That is a very particular kind of love, Your Grace. The kind that works. He looked at her for a long moment. The entrance hall was busy, people retrieving wraps, calling for carriages, the whole mechanism of departure in motion around them. Neither of them moved. She is not what you expected, he said. No. And yet, he said carefully, I notice that you have not revised your conclusions. She held his look. He was right, and they both knew it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Your Grace. James. Your Grace. She said it deliberately because she knew what it cost him, and she was not ready to pay with the alternative. I do not know what your mother's approval signifies in practice. A woman may approve in the abstract of a quality and disapprove entirely of a specific person embodying it. She used your name. She is polite. She does not, he said with quiet emphasis, use the names of people she is merely polite to. She has been polite to women she cannot endure for 30 years. She uses their titles. Margaret was quiet. I am not asking you to decide anything, he said. I am asking you to stop deciding against me on evidence you have already tested and found does not apply. You are... He stopped. A muscle in his jaw moved. You are the most careful person I have ever met, and I mean that entirely as a compliment, and I am asking you to be a fraction less careful, for a limited time, with me. Louisa appeared at the far end of the hall with their wraps, and the bright, carefully neutral expression of a woman who had timed her return with deliberate imprecision. I will think about it, Margaret said. It was the first concession she had made. They both knew that too. He inclined his head, the precise degree, no more, no less, and she turned and walked toward Louisa and did not let herself turn back. But she thought about it. All the way home in the carriage, with Louisa talking cheerfully about the music and their mother dozing against the window, Margaret thought about it. She thought about a man on a grey horse riding past an apothecary's shop in November and asking an innkeeper her name. She thought about a woman of 60 who had managed 40 years with grace and without bitterness and called it an education. She thought about the way he said, Miss Forsythe, as though the name was something he had decided to pay attention to. She thought about what it might cost to be a fraction less careful. She was still deciding when the carriage turned into Portman Street, and Louisa took her hand in the dark, quietly, saying nothing, which was better than anything she might have said. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Margaret was at the writing desk in her aunt's back parlour, composing a note to the steward at Forsythe House regarding the drainage situation in the North Field, when Louisa came in holding an envelope with the expression of someone who has been carrying something hot and is relieved to set it down. It came for you, Louisa said. It is not from him. Margaret took it. The hand was unfamiliar, a woman's, careful and formal. The seal was plain wax. She opened it with the small knife from the desk and read it once quickly, and then again more slowly, because the first reading had not quite settled. It was from a Mrs. Aldwick. Not Charles's mother. His aunt, a Mrs. Dorothea Aldwick of Bruton Street, whom Margaret had met perhaps twice, and remembered as a thin woman with sharp eyes and the quality of someone who catalogued information without immediately revealing its purpose. The letter was brief. It said that Mrs. Dorothea Aldwick had observed, with some interest, the recent attention paid to Miss Forsythe by a certain party of considerable rank, and wished to offer, in the spirit of friendly concern, a piece of intelligence that Miss Forsythe might find relevant to her considerations. The intelligence was this, that the Dowager Duchess of Wyndham had been heard, at Lady Fitch's card evening on Tuesday last, to remark that while Miss Forsythe was a young woman of evident good sense, the Wyndham family had a responsibility to the dukedom that extended beyond personal preference, and that she trusted her son understood this. Margaret read it a second time, then a third. She set it down on the desk with the careful flatness of someone placing a document they intend to file rather than act upon. She looked at the wall above the mantelpiece, which was hung with a small landscape in oils that she had always found uninspiring and found, at this moment, genuinely offensive in its determined neutrality. "What is it?" Louisa said. "Nothing." "Margaret." "The Dowager Duchess," Margaret said, with the pleasant tone she used for things that were not pleasant, "appears to have two registers, what she says to a woman's face and what she says at card evenings." Louisa sat down. Margaret handed her the letter. She watched her sister read it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the controlled nothing of her expression at the end. "It may be taken out of context," Louisa said. "It may. Or it may be invented. Mrs. Dorothea Aldwick has never been—" "It may be that too." Margaret retrieved the letter, folded it, and placed it in the back of the writing desk drawer. "Or it may be exactly what it appears to be, which is a woman of considerable intelligence saying one thing in private and another in public, which would mean that my original assessment was correct, and the revision I was beginning to consider was a mistake." Louisa was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done," Margaret said, 5 weeks ago. She picked up her pen and returned to the note about the drainage in the north field. "I am going to be sensible." She was sensible for 4 days. She was sensible at the Pemberton card evening, where the Duke was present, and she was civil and warm, and gave him nothing beyond civility. She was sensible at Lady Hartley's morning call, where he appeared briefly, and she contrived to be in conversation with 2 other women at every moment he was in the room. She was sensible at the Carrington recital, where she took a seat that gave him no practical position from which to speak to her privately, which required some advanced planning, but was entirely achievable. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He was not a man who missed things, and she had not been careful enough in the past 5 weeks to make her new carefulness appear natural. On the 4th day he sent a note. It contained 4 words, "Have I done something?" Not a question, technically. The punctuation was absent, which she took, correctly or not, as evidence that it had been written quickly, which was unlike him, and she felt the 4 words sit in her chest in a way that was inconvenient and informative, and that she chose not to examine. She wrote back, "No, please do not be concerned." He did not write again. She told herself this was the rational outcome and that she was grateful for it. She was not grateful for it. Charles Aldwick found her in the park on the 5th day. It was not arranged. She saw him approach from some distance and had time to consider walking the other direction, and did not, because she was beginning to find her own avoidances exhausting. He fell into step beside her, with the slightly tentative air of someone who is not entirely sure of their welcome, and has decided to proceed regardless. "You look," he said after a moment, "as though you have recently made a decision you are not enjoying. That is a very particular observation." "I have had occasion," he said with the self-deprecation she had always found disarming, "to make a great many decisions I did not enjoy." I recognize the expression. They walked for a moment in the comfortable silence of 2 people who knew each other well enough to have earned it, even if much of what they knew about each other was not comfortable. The park was full of the mid-April version of itself, bright and cool, the trees fully committed to their green now, the paths populated with the daily commerce of society going about its business of being seen. "I heard," Charles said carefully, "that you have been avoiding Wyndham. You hear a great deal. London is very small." He paused. "Is it because of what his mother said?" She looked at him sharply. "You heard that. Dorothea wrote to half of Mayfair, I suspect. She has always had a particular talent for the well-timed piece of information." He said it without venom, simply as fact. "She wrote to my mother as well. My mother told me." "And what?" Margaret said evenly. "Did your mother say about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "She said it was a shame, and that some men were simply too grand for their own comfort, and that you were well out of it." He paused. "Then she said that she hoped I had learned something useful from the whole affair, and left the room." Margaret almost laughed. It caught her by surprise, which laughter sometimes did. "Your mother," she said, "is more perceptive than I gave her credit for." "She has always been perceptive," Charles said. "She acted on it badly." He stopped walking. Margaret stopped too, because his tone had changed to something more deliberate. "I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as plainly as I mean it." She waited. "Wyndham," he said, "has been in London since March. I have seen him at 20 occasions in 5 weeks. I have watched him cross rooms, and avoid rooms, and angle conversations, and be more patient than I would have credited a man of his position with being capable of." He met her eyes. "He is not amusing himself. Men who are amusing themselves do not behave with that degree of intention." "Charles—" "I am not saying this for my own benefit," he said. "I have no benefit left in this matter. I made my choice, and it was wrong, and I know it. I am saying it because I stood in that position once, wanting something and lacking the conviction to hold it, and I know what it looks like from the inside." He paused. Don't let him lose it the way I did. Don't make it easy to lose." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The park moved around them. A child ran past, chasing a hoop. Two women consulted a parasol with visible disagreement. The Dowager said it at a card evening to women who gossip," Charles said, "and said something entirely different to your face. I don't know which one she meant, but I know which one he means because I have watched him mean it for 5 weeks." She said nothing. "Decide based on what is true," he said, "not based on what is easiest to believe." He inclined his head and walked away, and left her standing in the middle of the park with the child and the hoop and the disagreeing parasols, and the sudden clarifying awareness that she had spent 4 days being sensible in exactly the wrong direction. She sought out the Duke that afternoon. This required sending a note, brief, correct, requesting the opportunity of a brief conversation at his earliest convenience, signed with her name and nothing else. She sent it before she could revise it, which was the only way to send things one might otherwise revise indefinitely. He replied within the hour. "Tomorrow morning, the park, 10:30 JW." She was there at 25 past. He arrived at exactly 30:30, which she noted because he was always exactly on time, which she had come to understand was a form of respect rather than a performance of it. He fell into step beside her without preamble, hands behind his back, looking straight ahead. "You received a letter," he said. "From Mrs. Dorothea Aldwick, yes." "I see." A pause. "And what did it say?" "It reported a remark your mother made at Lady Fitch's card evening, regarding the responsibility of the Wyndham family to the dukedom, and personal preference, and the implication that the two were in conflict." He was quiet. They walked a full 30 yards without speaking, which Margaret had learned to understand as him thinking rather than conceding. "Did you believe it?" he said finally. "I believed it was possible. I had reason to. Because of Aldwick." "Because of Aldwick." She kept her voice even. "And because what your mother said to me at the Cavendish concert and what she apparently said at Lady Fitch's were not the same thing. People in that position, in her position, do not always say the same thing in public and private. That is not a cynical observation. It is simply an accurate one." "No," he said, "it is accurate." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were at the eastern edge of the path near the water, where the park was quieter, and the distance between them and the nearest bench of onlookers was sufficient for honesty. "My mother said to me last week that you were a woman of unusual quality, and that she believed you would make me very happy." Margaret looked at him. "She also said at Lady Fitch's something that was reported to you as caution about the dukedom. I cannot tell you precisely what she said, because I was not there. What I can tell you is that my mother is a woman who has spent 40 years managing what she felt versus what she permitted herself to say in public, and those two things have not always corresponded." His jaw was set. "That is not a defense of her. It is an explanation. She is not the Dowager Duchess at the card table. She is also not the woman who spoke to you. She is both, and she has spent a long time trying to reconcile them, and she has not always succeeded." Margaret was very still. "You knew this might happen." "I thought it was possible." He turned to face her. "I should have told you. I chose instead to hope that she would. That this time—" He stopped. "That is the thing I have not told anyone. I love my mother. She is formidable and perceptive, and in her way, kind. She is also a woman who, when she is afraid, retreats into what is expected, and what is expected of the Dowager Duchess of Wyndham does not always accommodate what is true." He looked at Margaret directly. "She is afraid, I think, that I am my father. That if I follow feeling rather than form, I will be careless with my life the way he was careless with his. She is wrong, but her being wrong does not make what she said at Lady Fitch's less real." The water was very still. A pair of ducks made their unconcerned passage across it. Margaret thought about 40 years, about managing and loving anyway, and the specific exhaustion of reconciling two different truths for 4 decades. "She is not wrong about everything," Margaret said quietly. "No. You are not your father." Something shifted in his face. "No. But you understand him." He held her look. "Yes, I think I do." He paused. "Does that frighten you?" She considered it honestly. "It would have," she said, "a month ago." "And now?" She looked at the water for a moment, then back at him. "Now I think that understanding what you do not wish to become is rather more useful than simply deciding not to think about it." He was quiet. What did Aldwick say to you? You saw us in the park. Yes. He said, Margaret said, that he had made his choice and it was wrong and he knew it, and that he had watched you for 5 weeks and that you were not amusing yourself. He is right. He said it simply, without decoration. I am not. He looked at her with the same directness she had been cataloguing for 5 weeks, the look that had made her cautious from the beginning because it did not contain the performance she had been trained to expect. I would like to say something without strategy, without calibration. He paused. I have thought about almost nothing but you since November. Not the version of you I imagined then. I understand the difference between a woman outside an apothecary's shop and a woman. I mean you. The actual person I have been meeting in drawing rooms and concerts and the side rooms of routs for 5 weeks. I am aware that this is rapid. I am aware that you have reason to distrust rapid. But I find I cannot continue to be patient and measured and correct while you use all of it as evidence that I am simply exercising good manners. Margaret did not look away. I am not exercising good manners, he said. I am extremely careful not to alarm you, because I am genuinely afraid of alarming you, and because losing your trust would be... He stopped. I am a man who is accustomed to wanting things and obtaining them without particular difficulty. You are the first thing I have wanted in many years that required me to understand that wanting is not sufficient, that I had to be worth it. The park was very quiet around them, or perhaps the park was its ordinary self and Margaret simply could not hear it. James, she said. He went entirely still. She had never used his name. They both understood what it cost her, or perhaps what it was worth, which was not the same thing. I have spent 2 years deciding that the lesson of Charles Aldwick was that I was not the kind of woman men chose when they were permitted to choose freely, that I was the practical option, or the temporary one, or the almost. I built my entire life on that foundation, and it was the wrong lesson. She held his look steadily. I think I may have been letting a fool's decision teach me things a fool has no business teaching. Yes, he said quietly with great care. I am not easy, she said. I have the ledgers and the estate and a mother who means very well and a sister I would do anything for, and I am not going to be uncomplicated or convenient or... Margaret, he said it differently now. Not Miss Forsythe, Margaret. Her name, the real one, in his voice, and it landed differently than anything had landed in 2 years. I came to London in March. Do you think I was looking for convenient? She breathed. No, she said, I don't suppose you were. He looked at her. The ducks completed their crossing. Somewhere behind them a child laughed. The trees were doing what April trees do when they have finally made their decision about being green, completely, unambiguously, without reservation. May I call on you, he said, tomorrow properly, with whatever I am required to bring, in whatever order it is required to be done. She looked at him for a long moment. At the face she had been studying for 5 weeks, which had been patient and careful and unperforming in a way she had catalogued and distrusted, and eventually, against her considerable will, come to believe. Yes, she said, you may. He called at 11 the next morning. Margaret's mother received him in the front drawing-room with an expression of such violent composure that Margaret felt a flicker of genuine fondness for her. Her mother understood entirely what was happening, had understood it for at least a week, and had managed to convey nothing whatsoever to the Duke upon his entrance, a performance that required a specific and underrated form of discipline. The conversation was correct and pleasant, and lasted precisely long enough for propriety, before Margaret's mother discovered an urgent engagement elsewhere in the house, and departed with the unhurried decisiveness of a woman who has planned her exit thoroughly. He looked at the door she had closed behind her, and something that was fully, unambiguously a smile appeared. She is excellent. She is entirely transparent, Margaret said. She loves you. She does. Margaret settled in the chair across from him, which maintained the appropriate distance while permitting the appropriate attention. You wanted to call properly. This is proper. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I also came to tell you that I spoke with my mother last night. Margaret went still. I did not ask you to. No, but it required to be done, and I should have done it earlier, and so I did it. He held her look. I told her that I intended to call on you, that my intentions were serious, that her remarks at Lady Fitch's had caused you to withdraw, and that this was the direct consequence of saying different things in different rooms, and that she had caused damage to the one thing I have cared about in some years. The room was quiet. How did she receive that? With the expression she wears when she knows she is wrong and is deciding how to be wrong gracefully, he said, which she can do. She is capable of it. It costs her something, but she can. He paused. She wishes to call on you, if you are willing. What would you like me to say to that? I would like you to say what you actually think, he said, not what is diplomatic. Margaret considered. I think she is a woman who has spent 40 years being careful about the right things for the wrong reasons, or the wrong things for the right reasons, and that the two have become difficult for her to separate. I think she said what she said at Lady Fitch's because she was afraid, not because she was cruel, and that there is a difference between those two things worth preserving. She paused. I think I would like to meet her again on those terms. He looked at her in a way that she was beginning to recognize, not the composed surface, not the careful strategy, but the thing underneath that he did not often permit the surface. You are, he said, extremely good. I am practical, she said. Your mother is a fixed point. I would rather find an honest accommodation with a fixed point than spend years in conflict with one. Most people, he said, would not have reached that conclusion this quickly. Most people, she returned, have not been balancing their household accounts against difficult fixed points since the age of 22. This time he laughed, fully without the restraint she was accustomed to, the laugh of a man who is genuinely surprised by something and has decided to stop pretending he isn't. It was, she discovered, a very good laugh, warm and direct, without performance. There is something else, he said when he had recovered. He reached into his coat and produced a small volume, slim, green-bound, the spine legible from where she sat. She looked at it. It was a collection of keyboard sonatas by Clementi. Louisa told me, he said, that the pianoforte at Forsythe House is slightly out of tune, and that you haven't played in 2 years, and that you used to play for 2 hours every evening. Margaret looked at the book, then at him. I cannot tune the pianoforte in Wiltshire from London, he said, but when you go home, and you will go home because the estate needs you, I thought. He set the book on the low table between them. I thought perhaps you might take something back with you. She looked at it for a long moment. The green cover, the name on the spine, the absolute simplicity of the gesture, which was not diamonds or a declaration but a small green book placed on a table by a man who had been paying attention. This is not, she said carefully, an appropriate gift from an acquaintance. No, he agreed. She picked it up. It is an appropriate gift from something else. Yes. She turned it in her hands. The pages were new, unread, unsoftened. She opened to the first sonata and looked at the notation, which was clear and well printed, and felt the entirely specific ache of something she had thought she had closed. Thank you, she said. He said nothing. She looked up and he was watching her with the open look, not the Duke, not the strategist, not the patience, just a man watching a woman hold a small green book and feel it, and being glad. The Dowager came on Thursday. She arrived with one companion, and without announcement, which was the prerogative of her rank, and Margaret received her in the front parlour with tea and the composure she had been building since 11 years old, and had come to rely on as her most durable possession. They were alone within 5 minutes. Margaret's mother had been encouraged gently to visit her friend in the next street. Louisa had an engagement with Miss Ashton that had been perhaps arranged with some intent. The Dowager sat. She looked around the room, not with the assessing eye of someone cataloguing its deficiencies, but with a specific quality of attention that Margaret recognized as genuine curiosity. She looked at the furniture and the modest carpet and the small watercolor above the mantelpiece and the writing desk in the corner with the papers on it, and she did not say anything about any of it. My son tells me, she said at last, that you understood why I said what I said at Lady Fitch's. I thought I might, Margaret said. He told you about his father. He told me what he chose to tell me. The Dowager was quiet for a moment. He is not his father, she said. I know that. I have known it for years. But knowing a thing and trusting it are, as you may have discovered, not always the same. She looked at Margaret with the frank examination that had been her characteristic mode on both occasions. I was afraid he would choose someone for the wrong reason, for softness, for convenience, for the path of least difficulty. She paused. He has not chosen that. No, Margaret said. I don't imagine I represent the path of least difficulty. The corner of the Dowager's mouth moved. "You represent, in fact, the path of most difficulty. You come with debts and an estate and a family and a damaged reputation and no fortune and an entirely unsettling habit of saying exactly what you think at the precise moment one hopes you will say something easier. Shall I apologize for that?" "Absolutely not." She looked at her steadily. "I apologize," she said, "for what I said at Lady Fitch's. It was said in fear, not in considered judgment, and it caused you harm. I'm sorry for it." Margaret held her look. "I accept that," she said, "and I will tell you what I told your son, that I think you are a woman who has been reconciling two different truths for a very long time, and that the reconciliation has not always succeeded, and that I would rather understand that than pretend it doesn't exist." The Dowager was silent for a moment. Something passed through her face that was too quick and too private to name. "James said you were the cleverest woman he had met since his grandmother. You mentioned that." "She would have liked you," the Dowager said. "She was not comfortable either." Margaret smiled, not the social one but the real one, which appeared less frequently and meant considerably more. "I take that as a very high compliment." "It is offered as one." The Dowager set down her cup. "He has been alone for a long time," she said more quietly. "Not for want of options, for want of the right one. I see now that I was in some danger of being the obstacle to the very thing I claimed to want for him." "We are all in danger of that," Margaret said, "from time to time." The Dowager looked at her for a long moment. Then she rose and Margaret rose, and they were of a height which was somehow appropriate. "I will not interfere," the Dowager said. It was said simply without grandeur, and Margaret believed it. "I would not ask that," Margaret said, "only that you mean the same thing in both rooms." A pause. "I will endeavour to." They shook hands, not with the gloved formality of an introduction, but with the direct clasp of two women who have understood each other and are deciding on the basis of that understanding to proceed. The Duke called the following morning and asked Margaret to walk with him in the park. It was a clear day, the kind that April produces as an apology for March. Direct sunlight, a light wind, the trees having committed entirely to their decision about green and looking very pleased with it. They walked for some time without particular agenda. He told her about Wyndham Hall, the estate in Yorkshire, the north-facing library he preferred in summer, the home farm that had been his project for 3 years and was beginning to justify itself. She told him about the drainage situation in the North Field, which had been occupying her correspondence for a fortnight, and about the tenant in the East Cottage who was 73 and had opinions about crop rotation that were mostly wrong but contained one useful insight per season that made his company worthwhile. He listened the way she had observed him listening from the beginning, entirely without waiting for his turn. "You will go back in June," he said. "The estate needs me in June. The hay must be got in correctly, or the winter is difficult for everyone." "I know." He said it without complaint. "I will come to Wiltshire in July, if I may. I have things in the north to settle in June." She looked at him. "You are proposing a schedule?" "I am proposing," he said with perfect equanimity, "that two people who have established obligations to their respective estates arrange to manage those obligations while also managing this." "This?" she said. "Yes. You are very practical for a duke." "I learned from an impractical father," he said, "and I have recently been spending time with an extremely practical woman. It has been instructive." She smiled. He saw it, the real one, and she watched him absorb it with the particular attention of a man who has been waiting for it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, not carefully. Those are not always different things. With you they sometimes are." She conceded this. "Ask then." He stopped walking. They were at the edge of the path near the elms, where the shade was partial and the light came through in the intervals of moving leaves. He turned to face her, and he looked, she thought, more himself than he had at any point since she had known him, less the Duke, less the composed surface. Just a man of 34 who had made a decision and was about to say so out loud. "Do you want this?" he said. "Not whether it is possible, not whether it is sensible or well-matched or likely to succeed. Do you want it?" Margaret looked at him. She thought about November, which she had not been there for except as the woman outside the apothecary's shop who had won an argument no one was watching. She thought about March, and the ledger that was wrong, and the elm trees just green enough to be hopeful. She thought about 5 weeks of drawing rooms and concerts, and the small library at the Hartley Ball, and a green book of sonatas on a low table. She thought about what it felt like to be decided on. Not settled for, not selected from available options, but decided on by someone who had crossed 3 counties to find her as she was, managing her debts and her staff and her difficult tenants, not performing softness she didn't feel exactly herself. "Yes," she said, "I want it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said simply, "Margaret." Just her name. The real one, the first one, without ceremony. The way he had said Miss Forsythe all those weeks ago, and then differently again, and now like this. Like something he had been keeping careful and was no longer required to keep. "James," she said. And that was in its way everything. He asked her father's question, formally, correctly to her mother, 2 days later, which her mother received with a composure that lasted approximately 4 seconds before dissolving entirely. He asked Margaret herself in the garden of her aunt's house in Portman Street, in the early evening, when the light was doing something gentle with the new leaves, with no audience and no ceremony, and the simple directness she had come to understand as his most characteristic quality. She said yes without hesitation. She had been less careful for 11 days, and she found that she was still standing. They were married in September, at the church in the village closest to Forsythe House, which was small and old and smelled of stone and candle wax and was entirely full. Louisa cried. Their mother cried. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew on the Wyndham side and did not cry, but held herself with a very particular kind of stillness. The stillness of a woman who is feeling something she has decided it is all right to feel. Charles Aldwick sent a very handsome gift and a note that said simply, "I am glad." Margaret believed him. The Northfield drainage had been sorted by August. The hay had come in well. The pianoforte at Forsythe House had been tuned in July, when a man had arrived from the village with tools and the information that he had been asked to attend to it by a party in Yorkshire, who had been very specific about what was required. Margaret had sat down at it that evening and played for 2 hours, the Clementi sonatas, which she knew from memory already, because she had learned them at 14, and the hands remember what the mind has set aside. She played with the window open to the summer evening, and the elm trees outside, fully, entirely, unapologetically green. On the morning of the wedding, while Margaret was dressing and Louisa was doing her hair with the focused seriousness she brought to things that mattered, their mother came in and stood in the doorway for a moment, with the expression of a woman who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. "I always thought," her mother said at last, "that what you needed was someone who could see you." Margaret met her eyes in the glass. "Yes, I don't mean your qualities." Her mother moved into the room, smoothed an invisible wrinkle from the sleeve of the dress. "I mean you. The whole of it. The ledgers and the Northfield, and the way you are when you have been reading something difficult, and the way you still love the oboe." She paused. "I thought it might not be possible. I am very glad it turns out to have been." Margaret took her mother's hand and held it for a moment without speaking. Then Louisa set in the last pin, and the light came through the window of Forsythe House for the last morning Margaret would spend in it as a Forsythe, and it was enough. It was precisely, completely enough. He was waiting for her at the church door. Not inside, at the door. Outside in the September morning, which had done the courteous thing and arranged itself into clear skies and the particular quality of light that makes England occasionally look like everything it believes itself to be. "You're outside," she said. "I wanted to see you arrive." He said it simply, without apology. She looked at him. He looked at her. 2 careful people who had spent 5 weeks negotiating the precise terms of being less careful and had arrived here, to a September morning and a small stone church and the whole of the rest of it, chosen deliberately by both of them. "Shall we go in?" she said. He offered his arm. She took it.